Good morning, I'm Maricar Bautista, sitting in for Mikey Oreta. And you're watching Basis Points, where we dive deep into the numbers and stories that drive our economy and shape our world. The headlines. Landbank of the Philippines asserts it remains financially sound despite its 50 billion peso contribution to the Maharlika Investment Fund. Russian President Vladimir Putin apologizes for the Azerbaijan Airlines flight that crashed after entering Russian airspace. And former U.S. President Jimmy Carter passes away. Let's take a quick look at the financial markets. Wall Street's holiday cheer ended abruptly on Friday, with all three main benchmarks closing lower in a broad-based sell-off. It has affected even tech and growth stocks that had driven markets higher through much of the shortened trading week.
As far as markets going down today and the sell-off that we're seeing in markets, I think it's a pretty normal reaction to the fact that we're up double digits strongly, 20 to 30%, depending on the index you're looking at year to date coming into this period. And I also think you have a lot of the senior traders and senior individuals and a lot of individuals in general at home this weekend, so that you've got, the tail end of this week. So you've got light volume, you've got some normal profit taking after the kind of run that we've seen. And you saw that run really broaden out in the back half of the year. So there's a lot of sectors and a lot of stocks that have participated in that run. And it's only normal to see some sort of a pullback as everyone takes a breather before we start what could be a pretty momentous 2025.
The S&P 500 lost 1.11%, while the Nasdaq Composite lost 1.49%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average also fell 0.77%. Over in Europe, markets are slightly up. The FTSE went up 0.16%. Germany's DAX index was up 0.68%, while France's CAC 40 went up 1%. The Landbank of the Philippines asserts it remains financially sound despite shaving off 50 billion pesos from its capital base to support the Maharlika Investment Fund. The state-owned lender issued a statement after the International Monetary Fund called on the Philippine government to replenish the capital of Landbank and Development Bank of the Philippines. The two lenders jointly provided the Maharlika Fund seed money of 75 billion pesos. Landbank said its capital adequacy ratio stands at 16.42% as of end November 2024, far above the 10% requirement. The bank flaunted that it was still able to remit a 32 billion peso dividend to the national government. Opposition Senator Risa Hontiveros questioned the usefulness of the Maharlika Investment Funds, or MIF, in looming economic storms. Hontiveros urged President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to prioritize capitalization of the Land Bank of the Philippines and Development Bank of the Philippines, or DBP. She warns that allocating billions of pesos in capital from Land Bank and DBP into the MIF has left the country's economy less prepared to deal with imminent economic risks. She also called the 75 billion pesos capital infusion from state-owned lenders to the Sovereign Wealth Fund as ill-timed and counterproductive. She urges the palace to prepare for imminent economic disruptions under protectionist policies of the incoming Trump administration. The Makati Business Club calls for a more transparent and accountable process in finalizing the proposed 6.3 trillion peso national budget for 2025. In a statement, the MBC commends the initiative of President Bongbong Marcos in scrutinizing the bicameral approved budget before its final passage. But the group has expressed alarm over the adjustments made by the bicameral committee. These include the 1.1 trillion peso budget for the Public Works Department, which is higher than the budget of the Education Department. The group warns this may violate the constitutional rule of giving the highest allotment for the DepEd. The group also questions the 26 billion peso allotment for the Ayuda para sa Kapos ang Kita program, citing the lack of information as to how this will be implemented. More short-term foreign investments entered the country last month. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas reported that the country attracted almost $97 million net inflow of foreign portfolio investments in November. but the figure is more than 80% lower than the 671.77 million inflows reported in November last year. The gross inflows also ballooned by nearly 20% to $1.86 billion last month from $1.57 billion in the same month last year. The central bank said the peso-denominated government securities attracted more than 70% of the registered investment, or $1.33 billion, while the remaining almost 30%, or more than $530 million, flowed into the Philippine Stock Exchange-listed shares. The Philippine housing prices inched down for the first time in 3 years. Data from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas or BSP show that the residential real estate price index decreased by more than 2% to 163.9 in the third quarter from 167.7 last year. This marks the first time the index contracted since nearly 10% drop in the second quarter of 2021. The decline was driven by the decrease in prices of duplex housing units by nearly 50% and a nearly 10% drop in prices of condominium units. The Philippine government wants to sell more of its assets to shore up revenues next year. This is after the Privatization Council, or PRC, approved the recent guidelines on the privatization and disposition of government assets. The Department of Finance, or DOF, said that the new guidelines for public and private sectors institutionalize the PRC's policies and decisions over the years, adding that these will be crucial to ensure that the process, rules, and regulations are clear and transparent. Privatization has already helped shore up revenues this year. The Finance Department said it collected 4.4 billion pesos from the Privatization Management Office's disposition efforts as of the end of December 2024. One of the notable sales include the disposition of the government shares in the North Luzon Expressway Corporation, worth around 2.9 billion pesos. The San Miguel Corporation-led new NAIA Infracorp or NNIC is probing the alleged unfair treatment of baggage porters at the Ninoy Aquino International Airport. This came after complaints were lodged against a third-party service provider who handles baggage porterage and retrieval. NNIC said it does not directly employ the porters, but it is committed to ensure fair treatment of all workers at the airport. The provider's contract with Manila International Airport Authority remained valid for 3 years after it was renewed in 2022. We're taking a quick break. Stay with us as we dive deep into the numbers and narratives that matter most to your bottom line. As we approach the end of the year, everyone is on the edge of their seats, closely monitoring GDP growth and what 2025 will bring to the Philippines. To tell us more about this, we're joined today by John Paulo Rivera. He's the Senior Research Fellow at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. He will help us comprehend how the economy performed this year and how it will affect the country in 2025. Good morning to you, John.
Hi, good morning.
Okay, so first question, John. The Philippine gross domestic product posted a year-on-year growth of 5.2% in the third quarter, lower than the revised 6.4% growth recorded in the second quarter and the 5.8% in the first quarter due to a contraction in agriculture and a moderation of growth in industry and services, according to NEDA Secretary Arsenio Balisacan. So what are your GDP forecasts for the fourth quarter this year and next?
Well, for the GDP forecast for the fourth quarter of 2024, so in a study that I did for the PIDS, so we estimate it at 6%. Fourth quarter growth because this is driven by the consumption during the holiday season. As we all know, the Philippine economy is driven by consumption, particularly in the last quarter, due to the holiday spending of our Filipino people. But for the full year, since at 6% fourth quarter, we're looking at a 5.8 to 6% full year growth of the economy for 2024, primarily driven by infrastructure spending by government, consumption, and of course, the investment.
Okay, so that's the basis for your estimates?
Yes.
Okay, so which sectors are you bullish about for next year and why?
Okay, I'm very bullish about, number one, the construction sector, which will continue to boom given the government projects, both public and private, as well as the boom again in the business process outsourcing, as well as the growth of tourism, both local and international. That will drive the 2025 growth of Philippine GDP.
Other than that, any other sector?
Another sector would be the manufacturing, the production. It's because, as we all know, 2025 is an election season.
Right.
So there will be spending on different areas that will drive up the economic growth, particularly in the first quarter of 2025.
So we should seize the moment.
Yes.
Yeah, this is very welcoming, at least. Okay. So in terms of inflation, the overall inflation increased to 2.5% last month from 2.3% in October, bringing the average inflation rate from January to November to 3.2%. What is your inflation forecast for December and for the rest of the year?
Well, historically, the inflation for the holiday season, particularly in December, tends to be on the uptrend. It's because of the spending, there's too much demand going on in the economy, given some limited supply. That's why for December, we're expecting a slight uptick in inflation driven by high consumption.
Okay, so what is your GDP and inflation forecast next year, and what will be the driving factors of it?
Well, for 2025, inflation would continue to stabilize at a healthy rate of 3%. It's because of the impacts of what our Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas has been doing to manage inflation, which we call that inflation targeting. But as far as the GDP is concerned, since, as what I have mentioned earlier, we are on an election season, this will be a good fuel for GDP growth, particularly in the first quarter, which would drive the full year, 2025 GDP growth estimate to be at 6%, similar to an estimated growth for 2025. And this is particularly driven by geopolitical threats, both local and international. So the persistence of conflicts abroad would hamper the supply chain that would impact inflation in the Philippines. As we all know, any conflict that arises, particularly in destinations where oil is available, tends to create an upward pressure on oil prices in the Philippines, which would again affect inflation rate in our country.
So that is something that we should always anticipate and prepare for. Okay. Then we were conversing earlier, so you mentioned also that inflation is not entirely bad or good. Well, definitely good, but there is a healthy range.
Yes.
So what is this healthy range, and how can we manage to sustain it?
Well, the healthy range of inflation, according to many economists and according to studies as well, is around 2 to 3%. Managing this inflation would allow both the demand side, the consumers, and the supply side, the firms, the companies, to be able to meet halfway in, okay, we're going to sell products at this rate, and consumers are also able to purchase it given their ability to buy, given their income. So that healthy rate allows an equilibrium, a status between the suppliers and the consumers, that they're able to continue their purchases and production.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier, next year, it would be not really a challenging, but an exciting one, because we are going to have our midterm elections.
Yes.
So in terms of inflation, you mentioned also that this will only be momentary. So how can we sustain it further beyond the elections?
Well, as mentioned earlier, the election season is a good fuel for the Philippine economic growth because it fuels consumption,
Right.
it fuels expenditure. However, it would be a challenge to sustain this growth into a more productive growth. Because the growth driven by election spending may be temporary. We're not always on an election season. But it would be up to our elected leaders this coming midterm election to sustain that growth through productive projects, productive initiatives that would allow the Filipino people to benefit from this so-called economic growth that because most Filipinos would say, the Philippine economy grew, but we do not feel it. It's a challenge for our incoming leaders to be able to provide the Filipino people the benefits of this so-called economic growth.
Yes, so that's very, very crucial to elect the right of officials in office.
Very
Yes.
important so that they can do something to be policy makers would be able to do something so that this growth would diffuse to everyone.
Okay. So for the last question, do you see any impact of the news that Landbank has given funds to the Maharlika Investment Fund?
Well, as long as the liquidity is still there and the dashboard of Landbank says that they still have enough capital, there's still capital adequacy, then we should only be able to monitor the liquidity status of the entire financial market of Landbank so that we are sure that the financial system is able to respond if ever an external financial risk would happen driving the sector to a crisis. I mean, just be very cautious, be able to monitor sudden changes so that we are prepared to cash out something to protect the financial sector.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rivera, a senior research fellow at the PIDS.
Thank you.
We're taking a breather. Basis Points will be right back. Only 2 people reportedly survived the plane crash in South Korea on Sunday. The Jeju air flight from Bangkok was carrying 175 passengers and 6 crew when disaster struck at the airport in Muwon County, in the country's southwestern tip. South Korean media showed footage of the sliding on its belly at high speed before it hit an embankment and exploded. Experts say the landing gear appeared not to have fully deployed before landing, but what caused the delay remains unclear. Aviation analysts say more evidence is needed before South Korean authorities can determine the cause of the crash. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has apologized for the Azerbaijan Airlines flight that crashed after entering Russian airspace in Grozny, Chechnya on Wednesday. But he did not say that Russia was responsible for the tragedy. A U.S. official told CNN that early indications suggest a Russian anti-aircraft system may have downed the passenger jet. Azerbaijan's president has also accused Russia of accidentally shooting down the plane. At least 38 people were killed in the crash. Among the survivors were 2 children. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has passed away at the ripe old age of 100. The Carter Center made the announcement. Carter, who was a Democrat, served as president from 1977 to 1981. During his term, Carter struggled with a bad economy and the Iran hostage crisis. But he brokered a peace deal between Israel and Egypt and later received the Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work. World leaders mourn the passing for former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Leaders, or on X, formerly known as Twitter, European Parliament President Roberta Metsola and French President Emmanuel Macron were among the European leaders expressing their sadness following Carter's demise. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer sent condolences to Carter's family, while Hungarian leader Viktor Orban wrote that his country will always cherish Carter's memory. In the U.S., President-elect Donald Trump said America owes Carter a debt of gratitude, citing his leadership at a pivotal time for the U.S. and his efforts to improve the lives of Americans. And that's it for Basis Points. I'm Maricar Bautista. We'll be back on Thursday for news on the financial markets and more. Keep it here on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel.